The morning air was thick with heat and the smell of fuel. At Clark Field, a row of Japanese Ki-84 Hayates idled under the rising sun, their propellers cutting slow amber circles through the mist. Pilots stood nearby, smoking, joking quietly about the lumbering Thunderbolts parked at the opposite end of the strip. They called them bakabuta, stupid pigs. Too fat to climb, too heavy to turn. Across the field, the American ground crews worked without a word. Sweat streaked down their faces as they loaded the newest weapon slung under each P-47's wings. 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets. Each one longer than a man's arm. Each one built to punch through armor, bunkers, and even small ships. When the first jugs roared off the runway, the ground shook. The Japanese pilots laughed again. Until, an hour later, they saw smoke pillars on the horizon, entire convoys erased in a single pass, trucks thrown into the trees, and radio silence from the North Road. The laughter stopped. The bakabuta had turned into flying artillery, and the Pacific sky would never sound the same again. In 1943, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was already a legend, at least over Europe. There, it escorted B-17s, and the P-47 Thunderbolt had been born from brute logic, not grace. It was the largest single-engine fighter of the war, more than 8 tons at takeoff with a 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine and a turbo supercharger that filled half the fuselage. On the ground, it looked like a farm tractor with wings. Mechanics joked that it could taxi through hedgerows and still fly home. In Europe, that ugliness had a purpose. Thunderbolts could dive faster than any German interceptor and claw their way back to altitude after hammering Luftwaffe targets with 8 50-caliber guns. They were tough, brutally tough, often returning with holes big enough to walk through. But even as they became heroes over France and Germany, few imagined the P-47 would ever matter in the Pacific. That ocean demanded range. Long hours over open water, far from base where fuel meant survival. The P-47 burned fuel like a battleship. Every pilot who had flown it knew this machine could fight, but it could not wander. The Pacific Air War belonged to lighter, longer-legged fighters, P-38 Lightnings and P-51 Mustangs, sleek aircraft that could leap from island to island without guzzling their tanks dry. So, as 1944 began, the Thunderbolt was quietly left behind. Then came the Philippines. General MacArthur's campaign to retake the archipelago would stretch across hundreds of miles of jungle, swamp, and broken infrastructure. The Japanese had buried their guns inland, beyond the reach of naval artillery and too dispersed for strategic bombing. MacArthur needed a fighter that could take off from muddy fields, absorb flak, and hit ground targets again and again without breaking down. The aircraft that fit that description was the one everyone had dismissed. Its weight, once a punchline, now became its armor. Its massive radial engine, so often criticized for drag, could take bullets and keep running. And its size meant it could carry something new the engineers at Caltech and the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance had been perfecting. A weapon that would change close-air warfare forever. The high-velocity aircraft rocket, or HVAR, was 5 inches in diameter, 8 feet long, and powered by solid fuel that burned so clean it left no smoke trail. It could punch through a tank's armor or blow apart a destroyer's hull. Yet most fighters couldn't lift more than 1 or 2. The P-47 could lift 10. The same pilots who once laughed at its bulk now realized they could use it as a flying gunship. No more strafing at treetop height, no more wasted bombs. They would fire salvos of rockets and level entire ridges. By mid-1944, the 5th Air Force had begun shipping P-47Ds to New Guinea and the Philippines. The men who flew them found that the jungle didn't care about elegance. It cared about power. And nothing hit harder than a jug loaded with rockets. As Japanese airfields fell and supply convoys scattered, word spread among American ground troops. If you hear a whistle overhead that doesn't stop, it's one of ours. The Thunderbolt was coming, and for the first time, its size made perfect sense. The idea of the high-velocity aircraft rocket didn't come from the Air Force at all. It came from the Navy. In early 1943, engineers at Caltech's Jet Propulsion Laboratory were quietly testing small spin-stabilized rockets for ship-to-shore fire. They called them Holy Moses. Unlike the unguided, finless projectiles used by the British, these new weapons used improved solid fuel propellant that burned hotter and faster, creating immense thrust with extraordinary stability. When Navy pilots began strapping them under F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs, the results shocked everyone. A single rocket could rip through a steel-hulled barge or blow apart a pillbox that had resisted weeks of artillery. But those planes could carry only a few. The Navy had built a bullet too heavy for its best shooters. That's when the Army Air Forces took notice. On the airstrips of New Guinea and Biak, maintenance officers were struggling to adapt their fighters to the harsh realities of the Pacific. Short, cratered runways, sweltering humidity, and hardened enemy positions dug deep into jungle hillsides. The Japanese were masters of concealment. Camouflaged tanks, anti-aircraft guns, and fuel depots vanished into the trees until a plane was nearly overhead. Too late for conventional bombing runs. The solution had to hit fast, flat, and hard. The Navy's 5-inch HVAP fit that role perfectly. It was small enough for a fighter, yet strong enough to carry a 45-pound warhead, more than 4 times the explosive power of a .50 caliber burst. Its speed approached 1,400 feet per second, and once fired it traveled almost straight, like a sniper's bullet drawn in fire. But mounting these rockets wasn't simple. They needed stable platforms, reinforced pylons, and engines that wouldn't choke on the extra drag. Most Allied fighters buckled under the load, except one. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its broad wings and rugged frame, could carry an entire battery. Where a Mustang or Lightning carried 2 or 4, a Jug could haul 10 HVARs and still climb. The ordnance crews at Fighter Command in Leyte realized they could turn each Thunderbolt into a one-man artillery squadron. By late 1944, experiments began. Pilots at Dulag and Tacloban airfields took off with mixed loads, 500-pound bombs under one wing, rockets under the other. They flew low, sighting along the cowling, timing their rocket bursts to rain fire into tree lines and bridges. The first results were imprecise but devastating. The shockwave from even a near miss could lift trucks off the road. As accuracy improved, tactics evolved. Pilots would dive at 20 degrees, fire in pairs, and watch the rockets streak out, twin spears of smoke and thunder, before pulling away through the haze. Whole Japanese columns vanished before the troops on the ground even heard the launch. At first, Japanese commanders dismissed the threat as exaggerated propaganda. Their fighters, they insisted, could simply shoot down the slow, heavy Jugs before they fired. But in battle reports from Luzon and Mindoro, a grim reality emerged. The Thunderbolts weren't fighting for air superiority anymore. They were erasing the battlefield itself. Each rocket strike left a crater wide enough to swallow a tank, and each sortie carried more firepower than a destroyer's broadside. By January 1945, American forces were using Thunderbolts to clear landing zones, cut off retreating columns, and even destroy ships moored at anchor. The line between Air Force and artillery blurred completely, and Japanese pilots, once so eager to dogfight, now climbed reluctantly, knowing they could not outmaneuver a rocket fired at the speed of sound. The P-47's legend had begun, not as a duelist's machine, but as an airborne hammer that could shatter an army from the clouds. To understand why the P-47 became history's first flying artillery platform, you have to start with its body. Every inch of the airframe was engineered for punishment. Where most fighters used light aluminum spars, the Thunderbolt carried forged beams thicker than a man's wrist. The cockpit sat high inside a bathtub of armor plate, protected on all sides. And behind the pilot churned the heart of the beast, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an engine so massive that ground crews nicknamed it the washing machine of war. It produced more than 2,000 horsepower, feeding a turbo supercharger that forced air through 20 feet of ducting, all packed inside the fuselage. The result was raw thrust and endurance. When other fighters flamed out from overboost or overheating, the Thunderbolt just roared louder. This mechanical overkill, mocked early in the war, became its salvation in the Pacific. A P-47 could absorb half a dozen 20-meter hits, lose a cylinder, lose oil pressure, and still bring its pilot home. The plane's sheer mass gave it stability, exactly what you needed when firing a 5-inch rocket that kicked like artillery. Each HVAR weighed over 130 pounds. When 10 were mounted under its wings, the Jug transformed from a fighter into a bomber with reflexes. It could take off from a rough airstrip, climb to 8,000 feet, and dive at nearly 400 mph into a column of trucks or gun positions. The moment the pilot hit the trigger, the sky lit up with white streaks and the jungle below disappeared under smoke and shockwave. Japanese soldiers began calling these attacks Raijin strikes, Thunder God assaults. The P-47's name, Thunderbolt, had never felt so literal. The pilots who manned these monsters weren't elegant duelists like the Spitfire or Mustang aces. They were blunt instruments of precision, engineers in flight suits. Many were veterans from the New Guinea and Solomon campaigns, hardened by years of attrition and mud. To them, the Jug wasn't a toy. It was insurance. It could dive through weather, shrug off flak, and get home even when every gauge screamed red. Its cockpit was hot, cramped, and loud, but it inspired confidence. Lieutenant Gerald Johnson of the 348th Fighter Group once said, "When you flew a Jug, you didn't worry about what was behind you. You worried about what you were about to destroy." Pilots learned to work in pairs, one to sight the target, the other to fire. They approached at low altitude, releasing their rockets at barely 2,000 feet, sometimes lower, then banking hard to avoid their own blast. The recoil shook the plane like a cannon, but the Thunderbolt never wavered. For ground troops pinned down by Japanese fire, the sound of a Jug approaching was salvation. They could feel the air ripple before the rockets even hit. Every Marine, every Army rifleman who fought under those skies remembered it. A deep mechanical growl that built into a shriek, then a thunderclap that rolled for miles. To them, it was God's own close air support. For Japanese airmen, the arrival of rocket-armed Thunderbolts was a nightmare wrapped in disbelief. The Imperial Army Air Force had grown accustomed to duels against lighter American fighters, agile P-40s or P-38s that could be met head-on. The Jug defied that logic. It didn't climb to fight. It came to destroy. When the first P-47s appeared over Luzon and Okinawa with HVAR salvos, Japanese gunners at supply depots reported seeing lightning bolts streaking from their wings. At first, they assumed it was a new type of bomb. Then came the shock waves, concussive blasts that flattened trenches and blew aircraft from revetments without a direct hit. Anti-aircraft fire became useless. The Thunderbolt could take damage that would tear a Zero apart. Even when Japanese pilots managed to engage them, they found the P-47 could simply dive away. Its terminal velocity exceeded 500 mph, far beyond the structural limits of most Japanese aircraft. By 1945, the nickname Jug, once a term of mockery, was replaced by a quiet phrase in Japanese unit reports: Reijin no Tobi, Flight of the Thunder God. What had begun as laughter at its bulk ended in terror at its precision. Every sighting meant another convoy gone, another depot erased, another impossible sound of thunder coming from a clear sky. By early 1945, Thunderbolt squadrons had rewritten the book on close air support. Gone were the days of cautious strafing runs and dive bombing from altitude. Now, pilots planned missions as if they were artillery units, assigning target grids, timing rocket bursts, and coordinating with forward observers on the ground. The 348th Fighter Group, based at San Marcelino, pioneered what they called rolling barrages. 4 P-47s would fly in line abreast, launching rockets in overlapping salvos that moved up a road or ridge with mathematical precision. From below, it looked like the Earth itself was erupting. Infantry commanders learned to call for Jug strikes, the way they once called for howitzer fire. Where artillery couldn't reach, dense jungle, steep cliffs, or hidden river crossings, the Thunderbolts could. Each sortie carried enough ordnance to replace an entire battery of field guns. To the Japanese, this was an entirely new kind of warfare. Their defenses had been designed to resist frontal assault, trenches, bunkers, caves, but the P-47 ignored geography. It could strike from above, sideways, or even behind. Even ships anchored in harbors found no refuge. One Japanese destroyer escort off Lingayen Gulf was obliterated by a single coordinated rocket attack. 10 jugs firing 20 rockets, half striking below the waterline. It sank in minutes. The Pacific Islands had turned into laboratories of firepower, and the Thunderbolt was the chief experiment. For the men on the ground, sound became the weapon's prelude. Every soldier, Allied or Japanese, could tell a P-47 apart by its deep, percussive engine note, like a drumbeat through the air. Even before its rockets fired, the noise carried a warning. Something unstoppable was coming. Japanese units began reporting loss of cohesion whenever Thunderbolts appeared overhead. Infantry scattered, trucks halted, and gun crews abandoned their positions before the first salvo. The roar of the jugs alone broke morale. Captured diaries later revealed the psychological toll. We fear the big ones. Their planes do not die. Their fire does not miss. This was not empty fear. HVARs could detonate at such velocity that shrapnel embedded itself in trees hundreds of yards away. Even a near miss could rupture eardrums or kill through concussion alone. To the Americans, that fear was a tactical advantage. Entire regiments could be pinned down without a single bullet fired. Air supremacy was no longer about dogfights. It was about dominance of mind. By the time the Okinawa campaign began, Japanese units had started constructing decoy tanks and fake depots just to draw fire away from real targets. It worked for a time, but it revealed something profound. The Thunderbolt had forced the enemy to change how they thought, not just how they fought. Behind the front lines, engineers at Wright Field and Clark Air Base studied every sortie. They logged accuracy, firing angles, rocket dispersion, and damage patterns. Their goal was refinement, to make the HVAR not just powerful, but predictable. Through their data, pilots learned to control rocket recoil, adjust for drop, and synchronize salvos with dive angles. By April 1945, Thunderbolt pilots could hit a tank from 800 yards with paired rockets, a feat unthinkable just a year before. The HVAR became the precision weapon of its age, and the P-47 its perfect carrier. This marriage of brute strength and scientific accuracy laid the foundation for post-war ground attack aviation. When the Korean War began, the U.S. would reuse the same rockets on F-84s and F-86, direct descendants of the Jug's philosophy. If it's strong enough, it's smart enough. But for the engineers who had first tested those rockets, the real marvel wasn't their design. It was the platform that carried them. The P-47 had proven that a fighter could evolve in battle, becoming something greater than its blueprint. It wasn't the fastest, nor the prettiest, nor the longest ranged, but it was adaptable. And in war, adaptability wins. By mid-1945, the Thunderbolt had rendered many Japanese air tactics obsolete. Defensive combat air patrols could no longer intercept effectively. Their Zeros and Hayats were nimble, but they were trapped in a world that no longer existed, a world of turning duels and aerial honor. The Jugs didn't duel, they obliterated. When P-47s began escorting bomber formations over Formosa, their combined firepower turned even aerial interception into slaughter. Rocket-equipped Jugs attacked airfields before takeoff, destroying aircraft in revetments, fuel dumps, and munitions stores. Entire wings of Japanese planes died on the ground. One Japanese colonel wrote after the war, "We expected battle. What we received was bombardment." That single sentence captured the essence of the shift. Air war had ceased to be combat between pilots. It had become total destruction from above. The laughter that once greeted the fat American fighter had vanished completely. In its place was silence, broken only by the sound of rockets shrieking down from the clouds. The roads north of Manila were supposed to be safe. For weeks, Japanese command had shifted supply convoys at dawn, fuel trucks, munitions wagons, troop carriers, trusting that low clouds and narrow valleys would protect them from air attack. Fighters, after all, couldn't hit moving targets in the jungle, at least not before that morning. At 800 hours, a flight of P-47 Thunderbolts from the 348th Fighter Group appeared over the ridges of the Zambales Mountains. Each carried 10 HVAR rockets and 2 500-pound bombs. The lead pilot, Major William Dunham, banked his jug into the valley and saw the convoy snaking below, trucks camouflaged with branches, tanks idling at crossroads. He radioed one word: "Mark." The first rockets screamed away like white-hot spears. Their contrails cut clean lines through the fog, 10 at once, each streaking downward in a fraction of a second. When they struck, the jungle erupted. Fire rolled through the trees as if the earth had opened. Metal twisted, men vanished, and the valley filled with the deafening concussion of rockets exploding in sequence. By the time Dunham's squadron circled back, nothing moved. Where there had been an armored column minutes before, there was only a charred trench of wreckage. Observers later estimated 40 vehicles destroyed. The entire supply route to Baguio had been erased. When Allied intelligence officers analyzed the attack, they realized what it meant. A single squadron of Thunderbolts had done more damage in 10 minutes than an artillery regiment could do in a day. The report reached MacArthur's headquarters within 48 hours. His staff immediately began drafting new operational orders. Thunderbolts would precede every major advance, striking communications, roads, and airfields. For the Japanese, it was catastrophic. The 41st Army, defending central Luzon, depended on convoys running north-south between San Fernando and Baguio. After 3 days of P-47 strikes, those roads ceased to exist. Commanders resorted to moving supplies at night, only to find the Thunderbolts waiting for them at dawn. The Jug's range, once mocked as insufficient, proved more than enough for short-range interdiction. They flew 5, 6, even 7 missions a day, landing only to rearm and refuel. The Japanese began to refer to daylight as the American hour. Thunderbolt operations reached their zenith in March 1945, when entire airfields were converted into launch pads for rocket missions. At San Marcelino and Lingayen, ground crews worked around the clock, lining up racks of HVARs like shells in an ammunition dump. A single squadron could expend over 100 rockets in one afternoon. The tactics were now exact science. Pilots dove from 10,000 feet, firing in pairs, 2 rockets at a time, then pulled up sharply to avoid debris. The explosions formed a rolling wall of flame that moved across ridgelines and valleys. When the smoke cleared, observers counted shattered tanks, collapsed bunkers, and bridges split in half. Ground units learned to synchronize attacks with these air barrages. When a Thunderbolt squadron hit a target, infantry advanced immediately, knowing resistance would be gone. The coordination was so precise that Japanese officers began calling it air artillery. They were right. The sound of the rockets was indistinguishable from a heavy gun battery. Okinawa, the proving ground of fear, then came Okinawa. By April 1945, the island was the most fortified position in the Pacific. Japanese troops had dug an underground city beneath Shuri Ridge, concrete tunnels, hidden gun emplacements, and tanks buried to their turrets. Artillery fire barely scratched it, so the 318th and 413th Fighter Groups brought in their jugs. Day after day, they launched from Ieshima and Yontan, carrying mixed loads of bombs and rockets. They didn't just hit trenches, they reshaped the terrain. Entire ridges disappeared under rocket barrages. Forward observers wrote in disbelief, "The Earth simply lifts, folds, and settles somewhere else." Japanese defenders soon faced a reality they'd never imagined. Even bunkers built to withstand naval bombardment could be cracked by repeated rocket hits. Tank crews began abandoning their vehicles at the first sign of P-47s overhead. Caves became tombs. The smell of burning fuel and metal hung over Shuri Ridge for weeks. The Thunderbolt had become more than an aircraft. It was a siege weapon, and for the Japanese army, it was unstoppable. A change in the sky's meaning. The pilots who flew those missions remembered the silence afterward. No enemy planes, no return fire, just the hiss of smoke drifting over what used to be a battlefield. They would land, rearm, and go again. Mechanical, efficient, relentless. Every sortie carried the same message. The sky now belonged to firepower, not flight, and beneath that sky, Japanese command began to crumble. Their logistics shattered, their morale dissolved, their doctrine of defense invalidated overnight. No strategy could withstand what the Americans had built. A fighter that had become artillery, a machine once ridiculed that now dictated the rhythm of war itself. The laughter that once echoed across the runways of Clark Field was gone. In its place was only the dull, distant rumble of rockets finding their mark. Okinawa. April-June 1945, the battle had dragged on for months, turning the island into a graveyard of steel and coral. Japanese resistance was fanatical. Bunkers dug deep, artillery hidden in limestone caves, gun crews fighting to the last shell. But by late spring, even the most stubborn defenders knew the end was near. It wasn't because of naval bombardment or infantry assault. It was because of the sound that came before every collapse, the thunderclap of P-47 rockets. Every morning, before the first Marines advanced, the Thunderbolts arrived in pairs and squadrons. They didn't fly high or circle. They came in low, almost scraping the ridge lines. From below, their wings seemed to shimmer with light, the reflections of rocket rails packed tight against the fuselage, and when they fired, the sound split the air like tearing metal. The unbreakable barricade. At Shuri Castle, the Japanese command bunker lay beneath 40 feet of reinforced concrete. For weeks, naval gunfire had pounded it without effect. Then, on May 25th, a flight of 12 jugs from the 318th Fighter Group attacked with synchronized HVAP salvos. The rockets tore through the upper fortifications, igniting fuel stores inside. Smoke rose in a single black column visible for miles. Within 20 minutes, communications from the stronghold ceased. That single strike did what days of artillery could not. It silenced the heart of the defense. American infantry advanced through shattered corridors that still glowed red from heat. When they emerged on the far side, one soldier said quietly, "That wasn't bombing. That was surgery." The kamikaze realization by mid-1945, the Japanese Air Force was collapsing. Fewer and fewer pilots remained, and those who did were being trained for suicide missions. But even the kamikaze flights faced a new terror, the rocket-armed P-47 interceptors guarding invasion fleets. During the Okinawa campaign, Navy radar detected inbound kamikazes hours before contact. By the time the Japanese planes broke through cloud cover, Thunderbolts were already climbing to meet them. Instead of machine gun bursts, the jugs fired HVRs. At close range, the rockets detonated in midair, tearing through formations of attackers. A single hit could shred a Zero into fragments. One surviving Japanese pilot later recalled in post-war testimony, "We thought their fire was lightning. Then I saw the sky open and my friend's plane vanish. The rockets had turned air combat into annihilation. No dogfights, no turns, no escape. The Thunderbolt could simply erase what it saw." By June, Japanese commanders on Kyushu knew that even if the Americans invaded, they would face more than ships and tanks. They would face flying artillery that could strike every cave, every trench, every hidden runway. And the enemy could not stop them, because by then, there was no sky left to fight for. The final missions. Fire over Kyushu. When the U.S. began preparing for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan's home islands, Thunderbolts were assigned to rocket suppression missions across Kyushu. Flying from Okinawa, they targeted shipping, airfields, and railway hubs, softening what would have been the invasion's first wave. On August 8, 1945, 2 days before the bombing of Nagasaki, A formation of jugs struck Kagoshima Bay, firing rockets into dockyards and anchored vessels. In one 12-minute attack, they sank 3 freighters and disabled an oil depot. It was one of the last combat uses of the HVAR in the Pacific War. Pilots returning from that mission described the eerie calm afterward. There were no Japanese fighters left to intercept them, no anti-aircraft fire, only smoke and silence. The war had turned into a one-sided equation, energy released from the sky, absorbed by the earth. When word reached them that Japan had surrendered days later, most didn't cheer. They just stared at their rocket racks being unloaded, their aircraft caked in dust and residue. One pilot wrote in his logbook, "We built Thunder, then ran out of storms." A plane redeemed by fire, the irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same aircraft mocked for its bulk, its fuel thirst, its clumsy profile, had ended the war as the most feared strike fighter in the Pacific. Its strength had become its strategy, its weight, its salvation. The P-47D Thunderbolt was no longer the escort fighter of Europe. It had become the hammer of the Pacific, carrying the legacy of American engineering into a new age of air warfare. When future aircraft were designed, the F-84, the F-100, even the A-10 Thunderbolt II, their blueprints carried the same philosophy: survivability, payload, endurance, and adaptability over beauty. The laughter of 1943 had become the silence of 1945. In that silence, the world had changed. When peace finally came to the Pacific, the P-47s sat lined along the airstrips they had built with their exhaust and fury, thick-bodied, paint-scarred, racks empty. Mechanics shut down the engines that had screamed for years and listened to the silence settle over the coral runways. The war was over, but the lesson the Jug had written in flame was only beginning to spread. Before 1945, the word fighter meant speed, agility, duels in the sky. After 1945, it meant something else entirely: payload, durability, adaptability. The Thunderbolt had proved that a plane didn't need to be graceful to win wars. It needed to be useful. Everywhere, strategists studying the Luzon. And Okinawa reports realized that the P-47 had quietly done something revolutionary. It had merged 2 doctrines, fighter interception and ground attack, into one aircraft. It could fight air-to-air when it had to, but its real strength was turning battlefields into ruins. Air Force analysts at Wright Field called this the Thunderbolt Principle. The fighter that survives long enough to strike again has already doubled its value. In an age when delicate, high-performance interceptors dominated the imagination, the Jug had rewritten priorities. Speed no longer ruled alone. Survivability did. Within 2 years of VJ Day, jet prototypes based directly on Thunderbolt data were rolling out of American factories. Republic Aviation took the lessons of the P-47's thick wings and fuel capacity and poured them into a sleeker frame, the F-84 Thunderjet. It was faster, yes, but it carried the same spirit: haul everything, get home alive. The engineers didn't forget the HVAR either. Those 5-inch rockets became the foundation for post-war air-to-surface ordnance, soon upgraded into the Mighty Mouse and the first guided missiles. The principle stayed identical: light aircraft carrying heavy, accurate fire. By the time the Korean War erupted in 1950, Thunderbolt pilots were training their successors on jet runways. They taught them dive angles, salvo timing, and the rhythm of low-level attack runs that had been perfected over Luzon. When F-84s and F-80s began striking North Korean columns, their tactics were exact copies of P-47 procedures. Even the vocabulary, roll in, fire pair, clear hot, was inherited directly from the Jug's radio chatter. Every blast of napalm, every unguided rocket run that followed in the next half-century traced its lineage back to those heavy planes over the Philippines. More than a technological milestone, the Thunderbolt represented a psychological one. It proved that raw force could be intelligent. Each HVAR strike had shown that accuracy and destruction were not opposites. They were twins. The pilot who could place a rocket inside a bridge span or a cave mouth wielded artillery without the need for an army. That realization reshaped post-war air doctrine. The United States no longer saw air power as support for the ground. The ground became the canvas, the air the brush. Every modern close air support mission, from the F-105s in Vietnam to the A-10s over Iraq, owed its logic to the Jug's transformation. Even the A-10 Thunderbolt II, built 30 years later, carried its ancestor's name not out of nostalgia, but reverence. It was the same idea reborn. Armored, survivable, relentless, carrying weapons that ended battles by shock and precision combined. For the men who flew her, the Jug never left their memories. They knew she had saved more lives than she had taken, because every Japanese gun or truck destroyed by rockets meant soldiers spared the nightmare of close combat. Veterans often said they felt more like artillerymen than fighter pilots. They aimed, they fired, they cleared the way. When those same men visited Air Force museums decades later and stood before restored P-47s, they didn't see a relic. They saw the first proof that technology and toughness could coexist. One pilot from the 413th put it simply, "She was ugly enough to survive anything. That's why we loved her." The Pacific War had ended, but its echoes were written in steel. Every future aircraft that blended endurance with precision, every doctrine that favored persistence over grace, carried a trace of that roar over Luzon, the sound of a machine that refused to die, carrying rockets that refused to miss. The world's laughter at the Jug had faded into awe, and in the silence that followed, aviation's future had already begun to speak. The Second World War had begun with aircraft supporting armies. It ended with armies supporting aircraft. By 1945, the success of the P-47's rocket missions had convinced every strategist that air power was not simply a component of battle. It was the battle. The Thunderbolt had done more than destroy targets. It had erased the distinction between offense and defense. No trench, ship, or bunker could exist beyond its reach. That principle, "there is nowhere to hide from precision fire," became the moral center of post-war strategy. When American generals briefed Congress in 1946 about the next generation of weapons, they used a single photograph. A Thunderbolt diving through smoke, wings trailing flame, rockets firing in pairs. It was captioned, "Dominance from the Sky." From that moment forward, the U.S. Air Force would not measure victory in miles of territory but in minutes of control. Whoever held the sky, even for an hour, decided the outcome below. The Cold War didn't begin with bombers. It began with the idea that you could break an enemy's will before meeting them. That idea had been born over Luzon. Analysts at the newly formed RAND Corporation dissected Thunderbolt operations to model what they called coercive pressure. They found that Japanese units often surrendered or retreated after rocket attacks even when losses were small. The sound, the timing, and the precision created psychological collapse. Rand's conclusion was blunt: perceived certainty of destruction equals actual control. That phrase became the philosophical seed of deterrence theory. Nuclear weapons would magnify the concept. But the foundation was the same logic the P-47 had proven. If you can strike anywhere, instantly the enemy hesitates everywhere. In quiet rooms at the Pentagon, strategists spoke of the Jug as the first deterrent weapon. It had turned laughter into silence, fear into paralysis. Through the 1950s and 1960s, aircraft changed shape, speed, and altitude. Jets broke the sound barrier. Missiles replaced rockets, but every new weapon still followed the Thunderbolt's template. Power delivered with precision by a machine that could take punishment and return home. When the A-10 Thunderbolt II entered service in the 1970s, its designers quoted Republic Aviation's 1944 field manual word for word. The aircraft must endure. Its pilot must trust it absolutely. The A-10's GAU-8 cannon, capable of tearing through tanks, was a direct descendant of the 5-inch HVAR's logic, overwhelming fire at close range from a survivable platform. Engineers didn't call it homage. They called it continuity. From piston to jet, the principle remained untouched. Firepower wins wars only when it keeps coming back. Even stealth technology would owe a debt to the P-47. When radar-absorbent coatings were first tested in the 1980s, designers referenced Thunderbolt airflow data, the same studies that had taught engineers how to carry heavy ordnance without losing stability. The ghosts of 1945 lingered inside every new blueprint. Decades after the war, surviving Japanese pilots visited air museums in the United States. They stood beneath the vast, gleaming body of the Thunderbolt and remembered the day the sky had turned against them. One former ace, interviewed in 1978, said quietly through a translator, "We thought it was too heavy to matter. Then we saw it was heavy enough to live." That comment captured everything. The P-47's triumph had never been about elegance or innovation alone. It was about endurance. It symbolized a nation's ability to absorb pressure, adapt, and come back stronger. For American veterans, the same endurance became a metaphor for their generation. They saw in the jug their own reflection, dented, scarred, loud but unbroken. A machine that, like them, had outlasted the war it was built for. When the engines finally stopped and the last Thunderbolts were sold for scrap or museum restoration, the Pacific fell silent. But pilots swore they could still hear it, the faint vibration of radial pistons and the distant crack of rockets leaving the rails. That sound was more than nostalgia. It was the echo of a turning point in human history, when technology had first learned not just to destroy but to dominate with precision. When a single aircraft could erase doubt as easily as it erased targets. The P-47 Thunderbolt had begun life as a punchline. It ended it as prophecy. Everything that followed, from Cold War deterrence to drone warfare, would repeat its lesson in 1,000 new languages. Strength is nothing without endurance. Speed is nothing without certainty. Power means nothing if it can't return for another run. The war ended long ago, but if you stand near a restored P-47 when its engine starts, you can still feel it, that low, rolling tremor that seems to shake the air itself. The old radio coughs once, twice, then catches, and the world fills with thunder. Not the sharp roar of a jet, but a deep, steady heartbeat, the sound of power that refused to quit. For the men who once laughed at it, that sound meant fear. For the men who flew it, it meant faith. The Thunderbolt was never graceful. It did not dance or dart. It endured. It absorbed punishment, carried impossible loads, and came back every time. It was the voice of an age that valued durability over delicacy, results over rhetoric. When Japanese pilots first saw it lumbering into the air, they saw an overweight brute. When they saw it return again and again, carrying rockets that could break mountains, they saw the future. That was the P-47's quiet victory, not just over an enemy, but over expectation itself. It proved that strength, when paired with precision, could become something close to poetry. Each rocket's scream was a stanza, each dive a verse, each mission a declaration that technology, courage, and stubbornness together could reshape the sky. Long after its rivets cooled and its name faded from headlines, the lesson remained. Every aircraft that rises today, whether it hums in stealth or whispers at the edge of space, still carries a little of the jug's defiance. It still follows the same unwritten creed: fly strong, strike true, come home. Because in the end, the P-47 wasn't just a fighter. It was a promise that no matter how heavy, how doubted, how mocked, the machine that keeps moving forward will always win. And as its echo fades over the Pacific, one truth endures in the silence that follows. The laughter stopped, but the thunder never did.